Tijuana. A name that should remind people of nightlife, music, and the neon lights of a border city just steps away from the United States. A city where tourists once came for tequila, bullfights, and the thrill of being only a few streets away from San Diego. But under those lights, another story was being written, in blood. Because behind the laughter, the music, and the promise of opportunity, Tijuana carried a darker reputation. A reputation so terrifying that international newspapers began to call it the murder capital of the world. Every border city tells two stories. On one side, there are dreams, of escape, of fortune, of crossing into America and finding a better life. But on the other side, there are nightmares. Nightmares carved into the streets by cartel gunfire, by the screams of families torn apart, and by the silence of authorities too afraid to act. And in Tijuana, the nightmare was bigger than anywhere else. Night after night, the city became a stage of violence. Gunmen in ski masks leaving bodies dumped on highways. Severed heads placed in coolers with handwritten warnings. Mass graves unearthed in the hills just miles from where children played soccer. This was not random violence. It was a calculated war. A war fought not for ideology, not for politics, but for one of the most valuable pieces of land on earth, the border. Because in the world of the cartels, Tijuana was not just a city. It was the Golden Gate. Whoever controlled this passage controlled billions of dollars in narcotics flowing into the United States. Cocaine, heroin, meth, all of it funneled through one narrow strip of land. And for that power, men would kill. But here is the question that will guide us tonight. How did a city built on tourism and trade transform into the bloodiest border on the planet? The answer isn't simple. It's a story that stretches across decades, of powerful families, ruthless killers, corrupt politicians, and civilians caught in a war they never asked for. Tonight, we will walk through that story step by step. We'll trace the rise of the Arellano Félix brothers, men whose cruelty turned Tijuana into a living hell. We'll follow the bloody clashes with rivals like the Sinaloa cartel. And we'll uncover how the city descended into chaos, until the very name Tijuana became synonymous with death. This is not just a crime story. It is the story of how hope was devoured by violence. It is the story of how a border city turned into a graveyard. It is the story of how Tijuana became the world's bloodiest border city. Pause, letting the words sink in. Voice shifts darker, slower. And make no mistake, everything you are about to hear really happened.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
Before Tijuana became a war zone, it was something else entirely. In the early 20th century, this dusty little border town wasn't feared. It was desired. People called it a playground, a city of opportunity, a place where limits disappeared as soon as you crossed from San Diego into Baja California. During Prohibition in the United States, when alcohol was outlawed, Americans flocked south. Tijuana gave them everything they couldn't have at home: whiskey poured freely, slot machines jingled in smoky casinos, and nightclubs stayed alive until sunrise. The city blossomed. For a time, it seemed unstoppable. Tourism poured in millions of dollars. Businesses thrived. Even when Prohibition ended, Tijuana held its charm: cheap liquor, lively music, bullfights, and the chance to experience Mexico just a few blocks past the California line. But what gave the city life, would also give it death. Because the same border that invited tourists, also invited smugglers. At first, the contraband was simple: alcohol, cigarettes, exotic goods. But the passageways, the networks, the knowledge of how to move things unseen, became a treasure map for criminals. And once narcotics entered the picture, Tijuana was never the same again. By the 1960s and 70s, the city was already beginning to change. Families came to Tijuana chasing work in factories, hoping to earn a living near the border. They built homes in the hills, filling neighborhoods overnight. The city exploded in population. But so did the underworld. For every family looking for opportunity, there were traffickers looking for control. Tijuana became a city of contradictions. A place where mariachi bands played love songs in the plaza while, just a few blocks away, deals were struck in the shadows that would fuel a billion-dollar drug empire. The U.S. demand for narcotics grew, and cartels in Mexico began to see the border not just as a line on a map, but as the single most profitable doorway in the world. And standing right at that doorway was Tijuana. By the 1980s, whispers of cartel activity weren't whispers anymore. Police officers looked the other way. Politicians took bribes. The city that once promised fun and freedom was becoming the perfect staging ground for something darker. And then came the families who would forever change Tijuana's name. The traffickers who didn't just want a share of the city, they wanted all of it. It wasn't long before one family rose above the rest. A family whose ambition and cruelty would turn the city of promise into a killing field. They were called the Arellano Félix brothers. And to understand why Tijuana became the world's bloodiest border city, you have to start with them. The streets of Tijuana would never be the same. Tourists still came, the lights still burned, the music still played. But behind the curtain, a storm was brewing. And once it broke, the entire city would drown in blood. This is where the story truly begins. By the mid-1980s, Tijuana was no longer just a border town of music and liquor. It had become the crown jewel of trafficking routes into the United States. Billions of dollars in narcotics would pass through its streets, hidden in trucks, cars, and even in the luggage of ordinary travelers. Whoever controlled this city controlled a fortune. And the ones who seized it were the Arellano Félix brothers. They were 7 brothers and 4 sisters from Sinaloa, born into poverty but raised in the same soil that produced some of the most infamous traffickers in history. The brothers had grown up watching men get rich off narcotics. By the time they arrived in Tijuana, they weren't content to play small roles. They wanted an empire. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather, was the man who originally opened the doors of the drug trade across Mexico. He was the mentor, the architect, the man who taught the Arellano Félix brothers how the game was played. And when Gallardo's empire began to fracture, the brothers took their chance. They seized Tijuana with an iron grip. What set the Arellano Félix brothers apart was not just ambition, it was brutality. They didn't simply kill rivals. They destroyed them. Torture, dismemberment, executions in broad daylight, their violence was a message: cross us, and you will not live to regret it. The family divided their empire like a corporation. Benjamin was the strategist, the brain who handled money and alliances. Ramon was the executioner, the man who built an army of killers so feared that his name alone inspired terror. Javier and Eduardo controlled other pieces of the business. Together, they turned Tijuana into a fortress. Their organization was unlike anything Tijuana had ever seen. They bribed politicians at the highest levels, bought entire police units, and placed their own men inside customs offices. For them, the border was not just a wall. It was a gate, and they owned the key. And yet, it wasn't enough to be rich. The brothers wanted fear. They wanted dominance. They turned Tijuana into their personal stage, showing the world their power through acts of violence that made headlines from Mexico City to Washington. In 1992, Ramon Arellano Félix orchestrated one of the bloodiest massacres in Tijuana's history. His men stormed a nightclub, opening fire with automatic weapons, killing innocent bystanders just to prove a point. This was the Arellano style, violence not as a tool, but as a spectacle. For years, the Arellano Félix Cartel controlled Tijuana with terror. People disappeared without explanation. Business owners paid protection or lost everything. Journalists who dared to write about them were executed. Their cruelty became legend, and their empire untouchable. But power always invites challengers. And in the shadows, another force was rising. A cartel led by a man who refused to bow down. A man whose name would come to define the war for Tijuana, Joaquin Guzmán Lora. El Chapo. The stage was set for a war unlike anything Mexico had seen before. Two giants, two visions of power, colliding over one city. And that collision would turn Tijuana into a killing field. The blood empire of the Arellano Félix brothers was powerful, but it was about to be tested. Because in the war for the border, there could only be one king. The Arellano Félix brothers thought they had secured Tijuana forever. Their grip was iron. Their violence unmatched. Their wealth beyond imagination. But in the shadows, another storm was gathering. A storm led by a man from the mountains of Sinaloa. A man who would not kneel, who would not retreat. A man who dreamed of controlling not just Tijuana, but every border crossing, every smuggling route, every river of cash flowing into the United States. His name was Joaquin Guzmán Lora. The world would come to know him as El Chapo. At first, it began with whispers. Chapo's men moving drugs through Baja. Small skirmishes on dusty roads. Shots fired in the dead of night, the bodies left to rot as silent warnings. But whispers turned to roars. The Sinaloa cartel was expanding, and the Arellano Félix brothers would not share Tijuana. Soon, the streets became a battlefield. The war was public, brutal, and merciless. Gunmen opened fire in crowded markets. Families were caught in crossfire on their way to work. Schools closed early as teachers rushed children to safety. The city became a place where stepping outside your home felt like rolling dice with death. The message was clear: Tijuana was worth killing for. Then came one of the most infamous events in Mexico's history, an event that shocked the world and revealed just how reckless this war had become. It was May 24, 1993. Guadalajara International Airport. The Arellano Félix Cartel had learned that El Chapo would be passing through. They assembled a death squad, rifles, submachine guns, grenades, determined to eliminate him once and for all. But in the chaos, in the smoke, in the blind hail of bullets, a tragic mistake was made. The man they killed was not El Chapo. It was Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, one of the highest-ranking clergymen in Mexico. The assassination of the cardinal ignited outrage. Newspapers across the world splashed the story: Mexico's drug war had killed a man of God in broad daylight. The Mexican government could no longer look away. Politicians who once took bribes were now forced to stand in front of cameras and promise action. And yet, behind those same cameras, many were still on the payroll of the cartels. The killing of the cardinal was not the only high-profile bloodshed. In the years that followed, politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement chiefs were targeted. Some were assassinated in their homes. Others were gunned down in their cars. No one was untouchable. And still, the violence escalated. In Tijuana, the Arellano Félix brothers unleashed their enforcer, Ramon. His army of sicarios roamed the city, striking fear into anyone suspected of working with Chapo. Torture houses filled the air with screams that never reached the newspapers. Rival dealers vanished by the dozens, their bodies discovered weeks later in shallow graves or dumped on highways. But El Chapo was no ordinary rival. He struck back with equal fury. His men ambushed convoys, spraying hundreds of bullets into armored SUVs. They bribed police commanders in Tijuana, turning the city's protectors into traitors. The war was no longer confined to the shadows. It was out in the open, and ordinary people paid the price. By the mid-1990s, Mexico was bleeding from every direction. But Tijuana was drowning. The murder rate soared. Businesses shut down. Families fled the city, crossing into San Diego with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The border, once a symbol of opportunity, had become a front line in a war for absolute power. And yet, as terrible as the killings had become, the bloodshed was far from its peak. Because what happened next would make Tijuana a city the world could no longer ignore. For years, the Arellano Félix brothers ruled Tijuana like kings. Their names inspired fear. Their power was absolute. Their empire stretched from the hills of Sinaloa to the beaches of California. But no kingdom lasts forever. And in the mid-1990s, the cracks began to show. The Cardinal's assassination at Guadalajara airport had placed the Arellano brothers directly in the crosshairs of the Mexican government. International pressure mounted. Washington demanded action. Mexican politicians, desperate to save face, promised that the days of impunity were over. But promises meant little in a land where bullets spoke louder than ballots. Behind closed doors, the Arellanos still lived like royalty. Their mansions glistened with marble floors, gold-plated bathrooms, and walls hung with European art. They threw lavish parties where singers performed for hours and champagne flowed like water. But beyond those gates, their enemies were circling. The brothers were no longer untouchable. Rival cartels smelled weakness. Their own lieutenants whispered betrayal. And El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel was pushing harder than ever, slipping drugs through tunnels, bribing their way into customs, chipping away at the empire that the Arellanos had built with blood. The violence escalated again. Ramon Arellano Félix, the most feared of the brothers, led his sicarios into open combat. Convoys of SUVs with tinted windows rolled through Tijuana like armored battalions, spraying entire streets with bullets if they suspected Sinaloa presence. But arrogance breeds mistakes. February 2002. Mazatlan. Carnival season. Ramon Arellano Félix had traveled with his men, blending into the crowds, plotting yet another assassination against Sinaloa rivals. But he didn't realize the hunters had become the hunted. A Navy patrol spotted suspicious men in the city. A chase erupted through the streets. Ramon opened fire, but the Navy responded with overwhelming force. Moments later, the most feared killer in Tijuana lay dead on the pavement. The news spread like wildfire. The executioner of the Arellano Empire was gone. And with his death, the aura of invincibility shattered. But fate wasn't finished with the brothers. Just weeks later, Benjamin Arellano Félix, the mastermind, the strategist, the one who had managed the empire's finances and alliances, was captured in Puebla. Mexican police paraded him in front of cameras, a trophy to prove the government's war on drugs was not a lie. Within a single month, the Arellano cartel had lost both its brain and its fist. Suddenly, their empire trembled. The organization split into factions. Cousins and nephews tried to fill the vacuum, but none carried the same fear, the same authority, the same ruthless genius. Meanwhile, the U.S. tightened its grip. DEA agents collaborated with Mexican forces, tracking cartel money through banks, seizing properties, freezing accounts. Millions vanished overnight. The empire that once seemed infinite now leaked wealth like a sinking ship. Tijuana, once controlled with iron certainty, descended into chaos. Small cells of gunmen fought over scraps of territory. Corrupt police shifted loyalties like gamblers switching tables. For ordinary people, life became more dangerous than ever, because without a single ruler, every street became a battlefield. But even as the Arellano Félix dynasty crumbled, one truth remained: power in the border city would never stay vacant for long. The Sinaloa cartel pressed harder. El Chapo saw opportunity. He moved in, claiming plazas, recruiting soldiers, bribing officials. But other predators also smelled blood: the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, even smaller upstarts hoping to carve their piece of Tijuana. The city that had once been ruled by one family was now up for grabs. The old guard had fallen. The empire of the Arellano Félix brothers was breaking apart. But what came next was worse than anything Mexico had ever seen. Because out of the ashes of one cartel rose a new generation of killers, more violent, more reckless, more unpredictable. And they would drag Tijuana into a storm of blood it had never known before. The fall of the Arellano Félix brothers should have been the end. The government boasted of victory. The DEA celebrated. Newspapers printed headlines declaring the Tijuana cartel broken. But power in Mexico is never destroyed. It only changes hands. And in the vacuum left behind, a new breed of killers emerged. The Arellano Empire had collapsed, but its soldiers, lieutenants, and street-level operators didn't vanish. they scattered. Some swore loyalty to the Sinaloa cartel, hoping El Chapo's rising empire would protect them. Others splintered into small gangs, desperate for control of any street corner that could move drugs. But some turned to outsiders. And those outsiders were unlike anything Mexico had seen before. They called themselves Los Zetas. Los Zetas weren't born in the mountains like the Sinaloans, nor in the streets like the Arellanos. They were born in the barracks. Ex-members of Mexico's elite special forces, trained in counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare, and urban combat. Men who once fought to defend the state, now using that training to wage war against it. And when they entered Tijuana, the rules of cartel warfare changed forever. Gone were the days when killings were hidden in shadows. The new generation didn't hide. They wanted terror on display. Heads left in ice coolers at police stations. Bodies hung from bridges at rush hour. Messages carved into flesh. It was brutality as propaganda. Violence as theater. The Arellano dynasty had ruled with fear, yes. But compared to what came next, their violence almost looked old-fashioned. The new cartels were unpredictable, fragmented, and reckless. Alliances shifted like sand. Yesterday's allies became today's enemies. Small cells of gunmen declared themselves kings of neighborhoods, extorting businesses, kidnapping for ransom, and executing anyone who resisted. And still, El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel pushed harder into Tijuana. With the Arellanos weakened, Chapo believed the city was his for the taking. But he underestimated the chaos left behind. The new generation of killers didn't fight with strategy. They fought with spectacle. Shootouts broke out in shopping malls. Grenades were thrown at police stations. Families vanished, swallowed into the machinery of kidnapping cells. Tijuana was no longer a cartel city. It was a war zone. Los Zetas in particular spread fear like wildfire. They weren't just enforcers, they were mercenaries, selling their services to the highest bidder. Sometimes they fought for the Gulf cartel. Sometimes for splinter groups. But always, they left a trail of terror. Their message was simple: obey, or die publicly. By the mid-2000s, Mexico's murder rates were spiraling out of control. The president at the time, Felipe Calderón, declared a full-scale war on cartels, deploying the military into cities like Tijuana. Soldiers patrolled streets with rifles, armored trucks rolled through neighborhoods, helicopters hovered overhead. But instead of peace, the violence exploded further. The people of Tijuana paid the highest price. Every family had a story: a son kidnapped, a father extorted, a neighbor disappeared. Journalists were silenced with bullets. Teachers stopped teaching. Shopkeepers closed their stores. And through it all, the cartels kept fighting for control of one border city whose value outweighed the lives of thousands. The rise of the new generation had transformed Tijuana into something unrecognizable. It was no longer just about drugs. It was about domination through fear, chaos, and blood. And yet, even in this storm, power was shifting again. Because while Los Zetas spread their terror, and while splinter gangs fought for scraps, the Sinaloa cartel continued to grow stronger. The question was no longer whether Tijuana would survive. It was whether the city could ever be saved. Because the next wave of violence would take everything to a level the world had never seen before. By the late 2000s, Tijuana was no longer a city in conflict. It was a city on fire. The murder rate shattered records. Year after year, the numbers climbed higher. Hundreds killed. Then thousands. Every street corner seemed haunted by the echo of gunfire. Every alley whispered of bodies dumped in the dark. Tijuana, once known for music, tequila, and border tourism, had become a war zone recognized across the world, a city where death was no longer news, but routine. Mothers walked their children to school knowing they might not return home. Taxi drivers drove in silence, praying they wouldn't pick up the wrong passenger. Store owners left small offerings at church before opening their shops, bargaining with God for one more day of safety. Fear was no longer an emotion. It was the air everyone breathed. Schools became battlegrounds of uncertainty. Teachers kept emergency drills not just for earthquakes, but for shootouts. Children learned the sound of AK-47s before they learned multiplication tables. Entire classrooms dove under desks at the crack of nearby gunfire. In neighborhoods once filled with music and laughter, silence ruled. Families locked themselves indoors at dusk. Weddings shrank to secret gatherings. Funerals became routine, with priests whispering prayers over coffin after coffin. And for those who stayed to work, survival meant compromise. Street vendors paid protection money to cartel collectors. Taxi drivers ferried sicarios between hits. Doctors treated gunshot wounds with trembling hands, knowing one wrong move could cost them their lives. The city itself felt alive, but sick. Bleeding from wounds that never closed. Yet in the middle of all this fear, stories of resilience emerged. A factory worker walking miles through cartel checkpoints just to feed her children. A local journalist, writing under a pseudonym, refusing to let the violence erase the truth. A priest who kept his church open through the night so the terrified could find shelter. They were small acts. Quiet acts. But they were also acts of defiance. Still, the violence consumed more and more. Bodies piled up in morgues. Hospitals overflowed. Families lined up outside police stations, clutching photos of the missing, begging for answers they would never receive. By 2008, the bloodshed reached its peak. That year alone, more than 800 people were murdered in Tijuana. In the years that followed, the number would climb into the thousands. International media called it a city drowning in blood. Locals had another word for it: hell. The city became a character in its own tragedy. A wounded giant, staggering but unbroken. A place that bled daily but refused to die. Through smoke and tears, Tijuana's heart kept beating. And that heartbeat was defiance, a refusal to be erased by the violence tearing it apart. But even as the people endured, the war raged on. Cartels battled, governments struck back, and the city remained the chessboard of powerful men who saw its people as pawns. The fire had consumed everything, and yet, the embers still burned. What happened next would determine if Tijuana could ever rise from the ashes, or if the city was destined to be defined forever, by blood. Tijuana today is not the same city it was during the blood-soaked peak of the 1990s and 2000s. But the scars remain. Walk its streets and you'll feel them in the walls tagged with cartel graffiti, in the whispers exchanged at corner stores, in the armored trucks that still patrol its neighborhoods. The gunfire is less constant now. But it never disappeared. Turf battles still erupt without warning. Families still grieve for the missing. And every so often, a body dumped on the roadside reminds everyone that the shadow of the cartels has never lifted. Corruption lingers like a ghost. Politicians smile for cameras, promising reform, but behind closed doors, envelopes still change hands. Police still disappear evidence. Judges still look the other way. The system may wear a new face, but the disease beneath it is the same. Tijuana remains a city of contradictions. On one side, dreams, families crossing into the United States for opportunity, factories buzzing with workers, nightclubs pulsing with music. On the other side, death, cartel checkpoints, drug tunnels, and the constant threat of violence. Dreams and death. Side by side. Every day. Tourists still come. They sip margaritas, take selfies under neon lights, and dance in the Zona Norte, never realizing that just blocks away, someone is paying protection money to survive another week. And for the people who call it home, life goes on. Mothers still walk children to school. Taxi drivers still crisscross the city. Workers still cross the border at dawn, chasing better pay in San Diego. They live, they endure, they adapt. Because survival in Tijuana is not just about avoiding violence. It's about refusing to be defined by it. Yet, beneath that resilience lies exhaustion. Entire generations have grown up knowing nothing but the presence of cartels. Children born in the 1990s, raised during the blood years, are now adults. Many work honest jobs. Some have joined the very cartels that destroyed their childhoods. The cycle continues. The legacy of violence is not just the bodies buried. It is the silence that still blankets conversations. The mistrust that lingers between neighbors. The fear that justice will never truly exist. And yet, in that silence, there is also defiance. Artists paint murals of peace on walls scarred by bullets. Activists risk their lives to document disappearances. Mothers still march in the streets, holding photos of sons and daughters taken by the war. The city has bled, but it has not died. Tijuana remains alive, chaotic, violent, beautiful, and tragic all at once. A city that refuses to surrender. A city forever balancing on the edge between hope and horror. At the world's edge, where Mexico meets the United States, Tijuana still stands. Not healed. Not safe. But alive. The cartels remain. The corruption remains. The scars remain. And yet, so does the will to endure. Because the truth is this. Tijuana is not just a city. It is a paradox. A wound that bleeds, and a heart that beats. The city at the world's edge remains a place where dreams meet death. So after everything, after the massacres, the betrayals, the rise and fall of kings, we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. How did Tijuana become the world's bloodiest border city? The answer is not simple. It never was. It lies in the hunger for power that drove men like the Arellano Félix brothers to turn a city into their empire. It lies in the greed that flowed like cash across borders, where US dollars fueled Mexican bloodshed. And it lies in the rivers of blood spilled on streets where children once played, turning neighborhoods into graveyards. Tonight, as you watch this, the story is still being written. Cartels still battle for routes. Politicians still make deals in shadows. And families still lock their doors at night, praying that the chaos doesn't come knocking. Tijuana has survived the worst of its history. But has it escaped it? Or is the next blood chapter already unfolding? The truth is this: Tijuana is not just a Mexican story. It is an American story. It is a global story. Every line of cocaine snorted in Los Angeles, every shipment intercepted in Texas, every dollar laundered in a New York bank, all of it ties back to this city at the edge of two worlds. So, how did Tijuana become the bloodiest border city? It became a stage, where corruption, cartels, and governments all played their parts. It became a mirror, reflecting the greed of nations and the cost of silence. And it became a warning of what happens when blood becomes currency. The border still stands tonight. But so does the blood. And maybe one day, when the last shot is fired, when the last body is buried, when the last deal is made, we will finally know if the story of Tijuana was ever truly finished. But tonight, it is still being written. You've just witnessed how Tijuana became the bloodiest border city in the world. Stories like this are not just history, they are warnings, still unfolding today. If you want more untold stories from the shadows, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to understand the truth behind the headlines. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and ensures that the silence of the past is never repeated. Because the world forgets quickly. But here, we remember.